Welcome back to the deep dive. Last time, we explored Schopenhauer's perspective on Socrates, seeing him perhaps less as a completely independent thinker and maybe more as a figure really shaped by Plato.
Yeah, shaped by Plato's pen, as we discussed, and that naturally leads us straight to Plato himself.
Exactly. So who was this Plato that influenced Socrates so much? And crucially, what did Schopenhauer think about him?
Well, that's our focus today. We're diving right into Schopenhauer's critique of Plato, specifically from section 4 of The Wisdom of Life.
And the central question we're tackling, the one Schopenhauer basically throws down, is, was Plato a true philosopher, genuinely seeking wisdom?
Or was he, as Schopenhauer kind of provocatively suggests, maybe more like a metaphysical poet, someone crafting these beautiful, lofty ideas, but perhaps for another reason?
Right. So Schopenhauer isn't just disagreeing with Plato's ideas, he's questioning the motive behind them.
Precisely. He accuses Plato of developing what he calls a false dianoiology, essentially a flawed theory of knowledge.
Okay, a false theory of knowledge. But Schopenhauer thinks there's more to it than just an intellectual error.
Right. Yes, that's the really interesting bit. Schopenhauer argues this wasn't just a mistake, it served a secret metaphysical purpose.
A secret purpose? What does he mean by that?
He believed Plato built this whole system of how we know things, not purely to understand knowledge itself, but fundamentally to support what Schopenhauer terms rational psychology.
Rational psychology, meaning
Basically a specific view of the soul, and particularly the doctrine of the soul's immortality. For Schopenhauer, the theory of knowledge was, in a way, secondary. It was a means to an end.
Okay. So the way Plato explains how we learn is actually designed to prop up the idea that the soul lives on after death.
That's Schopenhauer's charge, yes.
So what is this false dianoiology then? What are its key parts, according to Schopenhauer?
Well, at its core is this idea of an immaterial substance inside us, the soul. Plato saw it as totally distinct, separate from the physical body.
Okay, mind-body dualism.
Exactly. And crucially, Plato argued that the body isn't just separate, it actually gets in the way. It's an obstacle, a hindrance to acquiring real knowledge.
The classic body is a prison for the soul kind of idea, something that clouds our judgment.
Precisely that. And if the body hinders true knowledge, then the information we get through our senses, sight, hearing, touch, must be unreliable, maybe even deceptive.
So forget sense experience if you want real truth.
That's the Platonic view Schopenhauer is critiquing. The only path to genuine, certain understanding in this view is through pure thought, abstract reasoning completely separate from anything the senses tell us.
So the idea is our minds or souls can grasp truth directly just by thinking, and the physical world just messes things up.
That's the essence of it. And Schopenhauer points out the logical next step. If the body obstructs knowing, then the soul must function best when it's finally free from the body.
After death.
Exactly. So you see how this theory of knowledge perfectly sets up the argument for the soul's immortality. It all fits together, perhaps a bit too neatly for Schopenhauer.
All right, I see the link now. It's not just about knowledge, it justifies immortality. Where does Schopenhauer say Plato lays this out most clearly?
He points directly to Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo. Specifically chapter 10, he says it's all there, fully and clearly.
The Phaedo, okay.
He also mentions the Timaeus, where similar ideas appear, maybe with slight differences. And to really crystallize Plato's argument, Schopenhauer actually brings in Sextus Empiricus' summary based on the Timaeus.
Sextus Empiricus, what did he say Plato's argument was?
Sextus explained it like this. Plato argued that our senses perceive physical things by becoming like them. So sight becomes like light, hearing sort of resonates with air vibrations, and so on.
Makes sense. Like perceives like.
Right. And then Plato makes this leap. If the soul can perceive incorporeal things, ideas like numbers, geometric forms, abstract limits, things that aren't physical,
then the soul itself must also be incorporeal, non-physical.
Exactly. Because recognizes since the soul grasps non-physical ideas, it must share that non-physical nature.
That's a clever line of reasoning, actually.
It is. And Schopenhauer notes that even Aristotle, in De Anima, kind of played with this idea. He considered, hypothetically, that if the soul did have functions separate from the body, pure thought would be the most likely candidate.
But Aristotle didn't ultimately stick with that, did he? I thought he ended up seeing mind and body as much more connected.
You're absolutely right. That's a key point Schopenhauer highlights. Aristotle eventually concluded that even the most abstract thinking relies fundamentally on perception and imagination.
The famous nothing in the intellect that wasn't first in the senses.
Precisely. Nihil est in intellectu quod non creus fuit in sensibus. It directly contradicts Plato's idea of pure body-free thought. Aristotle saw that our concepts need raw material from the senses. You can't think about blue if you've never seen blue, essentially.
Yeah, that feels intuitively right. It's hard to imagine pure thought without any grounding in experience.
It is. And Schopenhauer points out this wasn't just an ancient debate. He mentions the schoolmen in the Middle Ages wrestling with this, trying desperately to prove that pure cognitions of reason, thoughts with absolutely no sensory input could exist. He names Pomponius as one figure tied up in these debates.
So this question just keeps coming back throughout history.
It really does. Schopenhauer then traces the lineage through Descartes and his school. He mentions de la Forge as an example.
Descartes, the father of modern dualism.
Right. His sharp split between thinking substance, mind, and extended substance, body. Schopenhauer makes an interesting side note here, suggesting that sometimes a great thinker's weaknesses are actually most obvious in the writings of their followers.
Like the disciples take the core idea and run with it, maybe exposing the flaws more clearly.
Perhaps, yeah. Anyway, Schopenhauer contrasts Descartes' dualism quite sharply with Spinoza.
Spinoza's view being
That mind and body, thinking and extension, aren't two separate substances, but just two different attributes, two ways of looking at one single underlying substance. Schopenhauer clearly admired Spinoza's view, calling it greatly superior.
Okay, so Descartes, Spinoza. Who else is in this picture?
Well, Leibniz, according to Schopenhauer, largely followed the Cartesian path, but then came a really major shift with Locke.
John Locke, empiricism.
Exactly. Locke's investigation into the origin of our ideas was crucial. His big principle, no innate ideas. The mind starts as a blank slate, a tabula rasa.
So all knowledge comes from experience for Locke.
That's the core idea. And then, Schopenhauer notes, the French philosophers, building on Locke via Condillac, took it even further. They came up with the phrase penser c'est sentir, to think is to feel or to sense.
To think is to feel. That sounds quite radical.
Schopenhauer thinks it's not quite right, but he sees a truth in it. All thought does rely on feeling, in the sense that perception, which involves sense feeling, provides the raw material. And he adds that thought itself is also a kind of feeling, physiologically speaking. It's conditioned by brain activity, nervous activity.
But wait, didn't Schopenhauer argue that Plato had a hidden metaphysical agenda? Does he think this French school had one too?
He does. That's the symmetry he draws. Just as Plato and his followers supposedly used pure thought to argue for the soul's immateriality.
The French school used thinking is sensing to push a materialistic agenda.
Precisely. For Schopenhauer, both were starting from a desired metaphysical conclusion, immaterialism on one side, materialism on the other, and constructing their theories of knowledge to fit. Both, in his view, were false paths.
So who finally gets us off these false paths, according to Schopenhauer?
Kant. Immanuel Kant is the hero here in Schopenhauer's narrative.
Okay, Kant. What was his big insight?
Kant acknowledged that, yes, there is knowledge that comes purely from reason, a priori cognitions, knowledge we have independent of experience. But, and this is the crucial part, this a priori knowledge only gets its real value, its validity, when it's applied to experience.
So we have these built-in ways of organizing the world, like mental software, but they need data from the senses to actually do anything useful.
That's a great way to put it. Kant saw this a priori knowledge as our awareness of our own cognitive machinery, the form of the knowing consciousness. But it needs content, material, which comes from empirical knowledge, from our senses.
And without that sensory input.
Without it, pure reason is just empty and useless, as Kant famously said. That's why his major work is called The Critique of Pure Reason. It's examining the limits and proper use of reason.
So what did Kant's critique mean for Plato's ideas in Schopenhauer's reading?
It meant the end of the line for what Schopenhauer called metaphysical psychology. It dismantled the Platonic idea of the soul as this purely active, independent thinking thing that could know reality without needing the body at all.
Because Kant showed that reason needs the senses.
Exactly. Knowledge without bodily perception has no material, no substance. The knowing subject, stripped of the body and its senses, is just an empty form. Schopenhauer even pushes it further, suggesting thought is basically a physiological function of the brain, like digestion is for the stomach.
Wow, that really grounds thought in the physical.
Yeah.
A complete rejection of Plato's picture.
A complete rejection. And after tearing down Plato's theory, Schopenhauer then contrasts it with his own doctrine.
Which is?
He argues that true objectivity, the highest form of knowing, comes from intuitive knowledge, knowledge gained through perception, but kept pure from the distortions of the will. That's his alternative path, which he explores, as he mentions, in the third book of his main work.
Okay, so wrapping this up, Schopenhauer's core complaint against Plato is that his whole theory of knowledge wasn't really about knowledge itself.
But was constructed to serve a metaphysical purpose, proving the soul is immaterial and immortal.
So back to that first question. Philosopher or metaphysical poet? Schopenhauer clearly lands on the side of Plato, being driven more by a poetic, metaphysical vision than by a pure, unbiased investigation of how we know things.
Yeah, he sees the conclusion immortality coming first and the theory of knowledge being built to support it.
It certainly gives you a different lens through which to read Plato, and it makes you think about motivations behind any philosophical system, really.
Absolutely. And it raises a fascinating question for you, listening now, with all the modern debates about consciousness, the mind-body problem, AI. How does Schopenhauer's critique of Plato, this idea of knowledge being tied to the physical, resonate today? Something to mull over.
Definitely. And be sure to join us next time because we'll be diving into Schopenhauer's take on Plato's most famous student, Aristotle.
That's right. You can find all our deep dives, including the next one, on YouTube and Spotify. Don't miss it.